Hi everyone, my name is Josephine Paparo and I'm delighted to be presenting today on behalf of the Australian Postgraduate Psychology Education Simulation Working Group, or APPESWG. The aim of our presentation is to share with you the national guidelines we've developed for simulation-based learning in professional psychology training. I'll provide a contextual overview as to why we focused on simulations, as well as some background as to who APPESWG is, why we came to exist, and what we have done in our time together, as well as where to from here. So I think we all know a major challenge of health professional training is providing authentic training experiences that balance the acquisition of professional competencies so that newly qualified clinicians are workplace ready, while also ensuring these skills are learned in a safe way that at the same time prioritizes the protection of public safety. Simulation-based approaches to learning offer one such avenue to strike this balance, where simulations are considered techniques that create a situation or environment to allow persons to experience a representation of a real event for the purpose of practice, learning, evaluation, and/or testing. And there's at least 2 decades of health professional research, including multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses demonstrating the effectiveness of SBLE in the training of medical and other allied health professionals. And what this research has led to is the routine and successful embedding of SBLE in medical and allied health training programs. However, the integration and acceptance of simulated learning activities, or SLA, as a credible pathway to the development of graduate competencies in the Australian professional psychology training setting has arguably been slower. This is despite preliminary studies demonstrating not only the efficacy but acceptability of SLA in the training of Australian professional psychologists, not only from the perspective of students, but also trainers. And so this led us to ask the question as to what is it that SBLE can offer, and particularly in the context of psychology. And so what we found through our research was that SBLE offers the potential to bridge the gap between what is known and making that knowledge actionable, and doing so in a way that boosts the students' confidence and competence by creating, a bridge between classroom theory and workplace practice. We also found that SLA could provide a structured, learner-centered environment where students learnt and practiced skills without causing harm to others. This also meant that the student felt more confident without needing to worry about the additional pressures of real-world practice being added before practicing with peers. SLA was also found to ensure a level of curriculum control that is not possible through training experiences acquired on placement, given how varied these can be from student to student. One of the criticisms about SLA is that it can be quite costly. However, what we found is once developed, SLA activities can be quite sustainable. We also found that there was significant benefit in providing SLA, which exposed students to appropriate illness scripts. And by appropriate, we mean typical illness scripts. As often on placement, students are exposed to sometimes atypical presentations that come to, for them represent what it looks like to treat someone with that particular presentation. But where we found SLA really come into their own is in teaching the skills necessary to manage high risk but low frequency clinical events that by their very definition and nature may not occur during the course of a placement. However, by incorporating into SLA ensures students still have knowledge and skills to manage them, which in turn ensures workplace ready graduates. And finally, we found that students trained in SBLE were additionally engaged, better prepared, and essentially more competent, resulting in greater ability to meet the demands of a range of placements. And yet, still, to our knowledge, there has been no systematic uptake or benchmarking of SBLE at the national level in the context of professional psychology training. So we asked ourselves the question, why? And there were a number of reasons that we thought may contribute to this, including the limited evidence base regarding the efficacy of these activities in the Australian context, as well as financial and workload issues associated with the implementation of SBLE. We also considered whether the current state of affairs whereby APAC standards limits the accrual of placement hours through this approach to level 3 but not level 4 programs may also be playing a role. However, for us, what we felt primarily was contributing to this was the lack of clarity and standardization as to how and when SPLE could appropriately and ethically be utilized for the optimization of professional psychology education in the Australian setting. So that brought us to APPESWG. When we first started, APPESWG consisted of 19 academics across 15 institutions, and we were first incorporated in 2020. And the reasons we came together were very much motivated by the training crisis caused by the COVID-19 global pandemic and the adverse impact on psychology placement opportunities that this saw, ranging from substantial delays through to cessation of placement opportunities. And so as a result, there was a real backlog of students awaiting course completion and a potential workforce shortage at a time when mental health support demand was outstripping the supply of workplace-ready psychologists. And so we saw that SPLE might be a potential remedy for the training crisis. However, as we continued meeting, we really came to realise this wasn't the first training crisis to face professional psychology in Australia, that there has been a contraction of professional training experiences and programs across the country for quite a number of years now due to a lack of opportunities to gain area of practice opportunities outside of clinical psychology. So maybe SPLE could play a role here too. And so what we identified, if that was to occur, was the need for a framework of evidence-based guidelines for the ethical and standardized design and implementation of SPLE in postgraduate training programs that were in accordance with best practice standards. And that really, this could have offshoot benefits for not only trainers and trainees, but importantly, the greater public. And so through consensus discussion, as well as the consultation of pre-existing best practice standards, such as those relevant to nursing, we developed a criteria of 9, which we felt should apply to SLA in the professional psychology training world. And so I'll run through those briefly now. Firstly, we thought that SLA should be directly linked to the development and/or assessment of specific trainee professional competencies, and that importantly, they should be designed to scaffold new learning based on existing skills and knowledge, but extending these in a way that was safe and posed minimal risk of harm to the public. We also thought that SLA absolutely needed to be authentic and parallel real-life psychology practice. Experiential and active learning principles that led to active trainee participation were considered important in terms of being embedded in SLA, as well as structured processes such that SLA needed to be designed and implemented in a controlled manner, which allowed risk to be better contained and learning to be more targeted. So for example, through the presentation of standardized client vignettes and very clear instructions. We also considered that we needed to make sure that SLA was supervised by suitably qualified staff who could monitor trainee learning, oversee the implementation, ensure sufficient safeguards were in place, and that outcomes could be reviewed. And that SLA needed to also have inbuilt processes whereby the work of the trainee could be reviewed, even if the SLA did not constitute a formal assessment component of their degree. And that also, ideally, that feedback that was provided would be presented with a clear linkage to the development of the competencies that SLA sought to cultivate. We also wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for trainee reflection on their experience and learning within the SLA, as well as feedback mechanisms for all stakeholders, including program authorities, supervisors, assessors, as well as the simulated clients and therapists, and that this would really afford for ongoing adjustments and improvements to the SLA. And so ultimately what we hoped is that this set of criteria would be sufficiently flexible to be adapted to different program levels and also areas of practice. We further imagined that we might need to spend a little bit of time unpacking the different ethical considerations that may be involved in the design and implementation of SLA. And as such, our guidelines document does incorporate a discussion of the roles and responsibilities of all relevant parties, as well as provides practical suggestions for employing ethical psychological practice principles that map onto the APS Code of Ethics at each stage of SLA. And finally, because we know that there are some reservations about SLA, our document includes a discussion of the perceived issues in the implementation of these activities. And in doing so, we really reflected on the views of trainers and trainees that we acquired through 2 surveys. And there were just some examples there of some of the potential issues or, I guess, reluctancies around the implementation of SLA that were proposed by trainers and trainees consulted. But I think if I really had to distill down to what the main concern that people expressed, it was really the time and resource cost intensiveness of this approach to student learning. We, however, believe that the benefits of SLA far outweigh these costs and that innovative outside box thinking can address this primary concern. And that brings us to where we go from here. And so something that we think could be quite instrumental in addressing these resource concerns is greater collaboration across institutions and possibly interprofessionally. So for example, if institutions could get together and create what is called an SLA bank, which addresses the costs by sharing the load across institutions, ensuring that the activities added to this bank comply with the requirements of SLA as per these guidelines. We also wondered if there was the potential to borrow from the medical model, who has been using simulation-based learning education much more routinely for far longer period than we have in psychology. And therefore, we could learn from the way in which they have addressed some of these challenges. So for example, the fact that psychiatrists donate some of their time each year to grading vivas, something that we could look at, whether we could ask clinicians in our greater community whether they would be willing to do the same. I think as well, something else that we determined might be required in order to move this forward is some collaboration around research. So for example, increased number of efficacy studies looking at whether SLA improves trainee experiences and outcomes, and importantly, whether there is predictive validity in the performance of trainees through SLA to, say, for example, placement evaluations, and that such research might additionally serve to increase institutional support and also wider acceptance of SLA as a valid pathway to the development of core graduate competencies. We also thought that there may be cases where perhaps SLA aren't optimal, and that may be that they're best suited to the cultivation of specific competencies and or other professional skills, so that research in this area could really unpack that. And finally, we know that there's a lot of emerging technologies such as virtual and online models of simulation that are less costly and far less susceptible to global and service challenges. And so some research on that across institutions could be inherently beneficial. Other avenues moving on from here is that we are currently consulting with APAC around the proposed definitions and standardized approach to SLA we've put forward in our document. And what we have really also suggested to APAC is that they might consider uniform recognition of SLA across level 3 and 4 postgraduate psychology programs, so long as the SLA activities contained in all such programs met the 9 criteria outlined in the guidelines for best practice SLA. And most crucially, that candidates were able to successfully demonstrate the requisite graduate competencies by the end of their respective program. Of course, that should always be fundamental and primary. And I guess finally, we would really love for some further feedback, and that's where you come in. So a copy of these guidelines, if you are looking at refining some of your SLA in your training of graduates, can be obtained by contacting myself, but also in an article that APPESWG have recently had published in Frontiers in Education. And if you do go on and adjust any of your SLA activities through these guidelines and the recommendations that are made, please do let us know how it goes. We'd be very keen to have your feedback. Also, just want to take a moment to acknowledge the contributions of other members of the Australian postgraduate psychology community that assisted with the development and the refining of these guidelines. So thank you to everyone who was involved in that process. I'd especially also like to thank HODSPA for their support of our endeavours. And so for those of you playing at home, and yes, I know you are all playing at home at the moment, I've just included some of the references from this presentation. Thanks, everyone. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and fielding some questions when we move to the interactive part of today.